Hello and welcome to the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. My name is Bob. This is another episode in my router table build series, and this is part 2. In part 1 I modified this plunge router to give it a screw adjust from the base plate so that it can be easily mounted in a router table and ease of adjustment from the top rather than going from underneath. In part 2, I'm going to build the actual router table to take this router, and I hope you follow along. Over the years I've made a number of router tables. My design is always temporary. It usually consists of a sheet of timber like this with a hole drilled in the middle and the router bolted from the underside, supported somehow, and I do a temporary fence which is usually screwed at one end and then moves across to increase or decrease the distance to the router tool. I've got some jobs coming up that I need a router table for, and this time I've decided I'm going to get serious and build myself a more permanent router table. The tabletop and bottom and the uprights are being made from 18mm thick ply, and the back is being made from 12mm thick ply. The overall dimensions of the table will be 400mm wide, 800mm long and 400mm high. The basic design of the router table is to be a box with an open front and 3 internal divisions. The central division will house the router unit, and the outer divisions will contain a drawer each. I also cut 2 pieces of 18mm ply that will form the base and the face for the fence. I used the bandsaw to cut out 4 right angle pieces that will form web sections to go between the face and the base of the fence to give structural rigidity. All the ply that I'm using for this build is structural grade, and this comes with a rough side and a smooth side. I start the build by gluing and screwing the sides to the base, so in this case the rough side of the baseboard faces down, and for the sides the rough side faces in. I am offsetting the sides both from the back and the side, and I mark and then drill the line of screw holes for each side before turning the base over and countersinking each hole from the bottom side. Here I have already done one side, but I'm using the same method for the other side, which I will show here. I have already marked a line to show the position of the side on the top of the base. Aligning the side with that line, I pull the base forward over the edge of the table and then from underneath drive the front screw. Turning it over, I then proceed to drive the remaining screws in. I'm checking the offset with my carpenter's rule, and I managed to get the first 2 screws offline. However, the end grain of plywood is pretty forgiving, so I reverse out those 2 screws, and I finally get the offset right with the next one, and then drive in the others before returning to those front 2 screws. With the back panel, I pre-drill the holes and then apply glue to the edges of the 2 sides. I then fix the back panel in place. The 2 sides were offset at the thickness of the back panel, so the back panel ends up flush with the bottom of the table. I now move on to fitting internal cross braces. These are made from 42 by 19mm dressed pine. I am fitting the bent one across the back of the table against the back panel. First I drill and countersink the holes for the screws. First I put glue on one end of the brace, position it, and then drive home 1 screw into this end. I then put glue on the rest of the brace, draw it into position with a clamp before driving a screw home to hold the other end. I then drive all the screws across the back panel. The front brace is the straight one, and at this stage I can only attach it by screwing in the ends. Next I install one more brace, this time along the bottom of the router table cabinet, Like before, I first glue it and then screw it into place. Now that the carcass of the router table is done, I'll focus on cutting the hole for the router foot in the tabletop. This I do using a jigsaw. You may not have realised, but I don't have a detailed plan for the router table. What I had is a concept of how it will look and the overall dimensions. This has allowed me to do an initial cut list, and now that I have the carcass together, I can judge the best position for where I want the router unit to sit, and thus where the hole for the router foot has to go, and in addition, the carcass makes a useful frame to work on the tabletop. Once I have made the hole for the foot, I can then mark out where the base plate will go. I then use my Makita trim router to cut out a 3mm deep recess to take the plate. To do this, I measure the distance from the edge of the tool bit to the outer rim of the trim router, and then clamp straight edges at this distance from the base plate line to stop the router going outside the recess area. I set the router bit to the depth of the base plate, which is 3mm, and then did test runs on scrap ply to make sure that the depth was correct before I moved on to doing the recess in the tabletop. Once I had finished routing out the recess, I went around with a chisel and squared up the round edges to complete the job. I will be fitting drawers to the cabinet on either side of the router unit. I'm going to use a simple method of wooden slide rails for the drawers, and I fit the rails now to the sides whilst I still have full access. I'm making the rails from 42 by 11mm dressed pine, just using scrap from my bin. I'm setting the rails down from the top by a distance of 42mm, and I have another piece of dressed pine scrap, and I'm using this as a spacer. Recall that I cut out 4 sides originally. I'm using the remaining 2 sides as internal dividers. To make them fit within the internal braces of the cabinet, I'm using a tenon saw to cut out 3 of their corners. Before fitting the dividers, I attached the drawer slide rails to their rough side. With this done, I then fitted the internal dividers, pre-drilling and then gluing and screwing them in place in a similar fashion to the rest of the carcass build. Before fixing the tabletop, I am using a trim router to cut 3 recesses that will take the T-tracks. I decide that the recesses for the fence T-tracks are too long, so after I cut the recess for the front T-track, I glue in small offcuts of pine to fill in the part of each recess that is no longer needed. Once the glue is dry, I use a hand plane to shave off the top of the inserts level with the tabletop. In each case, I plane away from the open end to ensure I don't dislodge the inserts. Once I have it level, I square the open end with a chisel to ensure that the T-track fits flush against it. Then it is on to fixing the tabletop in place. Once again, I am pre-drilling and countersinking the holes. I'm not using any glue for the tabletop, as being the area where the router is attached and also being the work surface, there may come a time when the top has to be lifted for repair, modification or replacement. You may think that I am using too many screws, and you may well be right. but I've put a lot of time into making sure the top of the frame is rigid and square, and I want to make sure that the tabletop is flat and remains flat. Next I screw down the T-tracks. With the table built, I move on to the fence. First I mark out where the tool recess will go, and then use a hole saw to cut the end of the recess, and I complete the cutting out with a handsaw. Finally I trim up the cut with a rasp. Having cut the tool recess in the face and base legs of the fence, I then pre-drill the face, put glue along the edge of the base, assemble, clamp and screw the face to the base. Having removed the clamps and wiped off the excess glue, I do a test to see whether the base and the face form a right angle to each other. The angle unfortunately is just less than 90 degrees. But inserting the web sections will fix that. I am offsetting the end web sections by 20 mm from the end, and I use my combination square and a pencil to mark the position on the inside of the fence. The web sections are 18 mm thick, and I adjust the combination square out another 9 mm and then mark the screw lines on the face and base of the fence before pre-drilling and countersinking the holes for the screws. I fit the first web section and clamp it in place. I confirm that the angle of the fence legs is indeed 90 degrees, and then I drive the screws home. I will repeat this process for the other end. I then mark the positions for the two centre web sections, which will be placed either side of the tool recess. Here they will also form part of the sawdust extraction manifold. Again, I mark a 9 mm offset from the position for the screw line. Next, I mark and drill the holes in the fence, which will take the bolts that hold it to the T-track. Up till now, I've been using the router base plate just as a guide to position the T-tracks and tool recess. Now I'm finally fitting the router unit to the base plate. If you watched part 1, you may notice that the router unit is missing its handles. In an earlier test fit, I realised that the handles would hit the tabletop when the router was being adjusted to the maximum height. So I've taken them off as they are not needed. Well, I built the router table. Here it is. I can use it to put nice edges and slots on pieces of wood. It's fully functional from that point of view, but it's not quite finished. Herein lies my problem. I like to keep my videos to 15 minutes or less, so they're not too boring. And this one's up there. So, despite promising that it would be a two-part series, I'm going to have to make a third part. Maybe we'll call it a sequel, so I'm not too embarrassed. Anyhow, join me in part 3, the sequel, where I will use the router table to make the drawers. I will build a manifold for the dust collection unit. I'll give it a good tidy up, coat of paint, make it look really slick. Can't wait. I'm sure you can't either. So, have you thought about subscribing? If not, hit the subscribe button. While you're at it, ding the bell so that you're reminded when the next video comes out. And I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.